Welcome to AnthroDish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dugnan. One of the most frustrating parts of watching Gossip Girl growing up was witnessing these elaborate breakfast spreads that had fresh waffles, bagels, croissants, pastries, fruits, everything you could imagine. And each morning, the main characters would just grab a tiny piece of toast or a strawberry and run away with anguish. When we think about fiction, food isn't always central to how a story is told, but what happens when it is? My guest this week is Margaux Vialleron, who is a French-born and Glasgow-based interdisciplinary writer and cook. She is the author of two novels, Breaststrokes, which came out in May 2024, and The Yellow Kitchen, which came out in July 2022. Her story, Fernanda's Fish Soup, was also runner-up in the 2022 Harper's Bazaar short story competition. She writes The Onion Papers as well, which is a hybrid newsletter about storytelling in the kitchen. Margaux's work explores the landscapes of remembrance and the links between inner spaces and wild outer spaces, as well as food and seasonality as communal experiences. In today's episode, Margaux unpacks the power of food as a storytelling device in fiction, the consequences of character development relating to appetite and economics, and the power of the kitchen in writing but also in real life. Margaux is a beautiful writer, and I know a lot of the warmth in her work comes from the time that she dedicates to describing food and eating in her character development. So it's a special treat to hear her perspectives on how to incorporate this into fictional worlds. Here's my conversation with Margaux. All right, welcome to the show, Margaux. How are you doing today?
I'm very good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being on. I'm really delighted to be able to have this conversation today. When you pitched it, it was like something I never thought about. So I'm very curious to kind of dive in further. But before we get into it, do you mind sharing a snapshot of who you are, where you're coming in from, and the type of work that you do?
Of course. So as listener might hear, I am French, but I am actually based in Scotland, in Glasgow. And most of my writing is done in English. So I always have this kind of non-native speaker approach to language, which will, I think, fit into our conversation quite naturally because I use food, and I have used food as a way to learn English early on. So I would say my writing tends to be quite central, and I use my senses a lot when I am running short in vocabulary. So I'm a writer, and I write novels. I have two novels published, and I also write some food writing, nonfiction in general. So quite varied, interdisciplinary, I believe, is.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, I feel like you're the face of interdisciplinary approaches to writing, which I really, really love. Something I'm wondering about is in terms of your kind of relationship with food, if you can describe some of the like flavors or ingredients that really define your relationship and if those changed, particularly as you were learning languages.
Yeah, well, I learned to cook quite late on in my life, actually around the same time as I learned English, which is when I moved to London and kind of was in a flat share with amazing cooks and had to speak with them while also learning how to use onion and garlic and stuff like that. I would never even think about buying before. But in general, my own cooking, I think, is more kind of. I'm very interested in kind of knitting process. I'm quite solo cook. I like to cook on my own, and something that would take me a lot of time and I can pause and return to. I use really cooking as a mind exercise almost more than actually feeding myself. In terms of everyday feeding, I would say my partner is probably with actually doing something that end up into a meal we can consume, where I will spend a lot of time with my sourdough, filling it, knitting bread, experimenting with it. I absolutely love making pasta and working on different shape, sitting around the table and kind of doing that and posing. And in between those kind of knitting feasts, I would just go and start writing and drive and go back. And I found this really helpful because it's both almost like a Pomodoro technique where I can focus, go back to focus, but it also helps me to kind of stay in tune with how I'm feeling, my body. I don't know, I just find writing is often seen as something so lethargic almost and solitary, where it requires a lot of endurance, and I find it really tiring. And often, I don't know if like I'm struggling to come up with a sentence or something, I would just find myself jumping out of my chair, go around the room and sit down again and try to write it. And I guess that's kind of how I started to use as well food and cooking and trying to stay in tune with that body experiment. So yeah, that was a very long answer to say I do a lot of donating, especially bread and pasta.
Oh, that's incredible. It's interesting to hear you say that too, because I also came to cooking really late in life, which I feel like people, you don't like when you make a public face around like food and writing, people kind of assume that you grew up with like a grandmother that like taught you how to can and make, and make pies and stuff. And I similarly, it was like I lucked out into friends that knew how to cook. And I often wonder like how much that shaped the relationship. And particularly, as you said, like that ability to kind of almost have it as a meditative process in between other acts that are like much more mentally straining as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, there is no background with food. I wish sometimes, but teams were the thing in my house.
I love it. I honestly like I don't come across many people that share that, so that makes me happy. So one thing I wanted to dive into too is a lot of your work, food is a really, really central piece in what you write, not only in your like in your newsletter, but also in your fiction. It plays a pretty pivotal role. So I'm curious to just hear it in your own words. Like how do you use food in your writing? What roles does it play?
It's like, it's a center, I don't know, if you use an image, like I would say, if you look at let's use the tree, like language would be the roots. That's like the basis of the idea, and that's kind of what I'm using to convey ideas. And food would be the branches. It's kind of what's helping me to link all my ideas and to make it more grounded and real. I found that, food will convey so much. Food can be so conforming and freeing at the same time. Food is system. Food is different within your culture, your social means. If you just start looking at food, you just get all these kind of snippets of who a person is, what opportunities a person has had, everything. But it's also kind of a more natural way, an organic way of doing it without kind of having to write it per se, but showing it. So yeah, I found it so important in fiction because it's almost a framework. And I think, and I chat about it, it just makes me very angry when I read a book and nobody ever eats. I just find it very confusing. Or, I don't know, nobody's friend is a chef or has ever worked in hospitality. But who are those people? I just find it confusing. And yeah, it kind of, especially when you're reading like all those, especially at the moment, I think there is a big movement in contemporary fiction to try to depict the everyday, trying to be really anchored how we feel every day and the daily, but we've removed food, or food is used in a very stage way, but actually it's the most daily thing you're doing without thinking. You will get up and go and grab a snack or munch the kitchen counter. Like we don't all set up the table every day to have a meal.
Yeah, it's very true. And it kind of, I wanted to get your take on something else that I was thinking about in tandem with this conversation, because there's a lot going on online right now around like the shift to first person narratives and away from like third person in writing, in particular in TV too. I'm like breaking the fourth wall and stuff. And I was thinking about a book that I read last year that it just drove me nuts, and I won't name it, but in the book, the only time food was used, it was like I think it was called like night burgers, and so it was just like something dropped off at the door and the person was like eating them, and it was this whole bit about kind of sliding into a bad mental state after like a relationship issue. But that was the only time food was used, and again, it was very first person. So I'm curious, like, do you think that, or I guess why do you think food gets left out in books to start?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if some people just think it's very mundane. I know I'm just doing some guesswork, right? I'm in nobody's head, but it almost like as if it's not interest. Would it be boring to mention the food? But no, that's a connector. But then I guess it's a very selfish answer because I am interested in it and I want people to be interested in it because I write about this. But I do wonder if there is a bit of that. And then in the first person as well sometimes, and that is something though that I'm also dealing with a lot, especially as a woman. There is a lot of, you know, shame and guilt around how do we eat? Do we eat much? Do we not eat enough? How is your body? And people will feel very entitled to make comments about everyone's diet, especially, I guess, my diet is very open on the internet because I have a newsletter about how I eat.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, that's really interesting, the type of comments I get from that. Sometimes I think, wow, that's like, people feel very like much they know everything about you because they know how you eat. But I'm not gonna say something groundbreaking here. I actually don't share everything I eat. No, that's not all about it. And I don't know, I wonder if there is a bit of almost censorship and restraint in trying to not to say how people eat. That's a whole other kind of worms, isn't it? So yeah, I think it's a mixture of mundanity and being afraid that it's almost not worth mentioning if it's just not going to be really a plot switch or really important in a book, and also a mixture of it being a bit too scary almost and too exposing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that's something, as you said, like food tends to just be used as a device rather than the reality, which is like how many of us are stewing over some email that we got and like going to the cupboard and just kind of staring or like picking up a snack and not thinking about it. But I think, especially in regard to like the idea of like a lack of food at the table, I think of the really classic example of like Gossip Girl, where they have these like really ornate Upper East Side New York breakfasts and then nobody touches them at all, which just is like, why would you do that?
Yeah, yes. I think that makes me even angrier. When you have like a weird scene in a restaurant and the plates are, and then they also get taken away, but nobody has eaten a bit. I'm like, that's a waste as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I guess you could say that's character development. Maybe those people are just extremely entitled and have never known being hungry, so they don't care.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah. And it strikes me as interesting too, because the idea of like not eating food when you're particularly in like fiction could be really powerful in terms of determining other elements of a character too. Do you mind speaking a little bit to like how you can shape character through what types of food they eat or what types of food they don't eat or appetite in general?
Hmm. Yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, there is like a very easy, cultural background to how someone will be eating and what type of ingredients they're going for, flavors. There is also an aspect maybe of illness or requirement if you have dietary requirements. So I just think that really useful is getting that kind of character development and showing who a person is without having to say it again. But I also think that really useful to show links between people, like what are you cooking for? What are you sitting at the table with? What are the dynamics then? Are those characters very comfortable? How do they treat the staff? Like, I often feel as well, if you are not looking at a fiction scene and you are in a restaurant, I find making a character interacting with a waiter really, really helpful because it will show so much about their behaviors with others. And that can be just a 2-sentence thing. And here you have such a like open window over that person. So yeah, I just think it's a shame with today's 90s because it's just so helpful. You can get an insight on which season it is. You can get like so many natural clues that just come through very, very naturally.
Yeah. Yeah. I think particularly thinking about seasonality and like landscape building and the idea of showing rather than telling, like, I mean, I'm sure that's a difficult thing in some cases, like as you're writing novels, but ultimately the reader comes away with an experience where they were able to connect those dots and have those moments themselves where it's like, oh, okay, this person is quite rude to this waiter. So what does that say about like the actual dynamic that's happening with their friend group or with the other people that are playing central roles in that plot as well?
Definitely.
Do you think food can play a role in like plotting as well, or is it more kind of building up landscape and background to what's happening?
Yeah, I think definitely on plotting, like there's been quite a few, short stories based around like a dinner party or something like that, or recently the Japanese translation of butter was everywhere. I think food is really important as well in the book. I haven't read it, to be honest, so I can't say much about it. but there is kind of, it can be used definitely as a certain plot development. I think, to speak about what I know the most, my books.
Yes.
For example, my debut novel, The Yellow Kitchen, food was very much like a big central piece. It's in the title.
Yeah.
It was used as kind of a link between all the characters. And I think here you really had, one of them was called Claude and was very much the kind of interlink between those three women, and was always cooking for them. And there was really long descriptions about how she cooks, how she eats, how she uses food as almost a mirror of how she's feeling and her mindset. Whereas in my second novel, Breaststrokes, it's been really interesting because I didn't think about the food at all as I was writing it. But everyone has been telling me that the food is everywhere in the book.
Yep.
So that has been so fascinating to me. But it is a book that is very much centered. It's only based over 48 hours. So I had a very small time frame to be looking at quite a big topic. And actually, what else than food? If I'm going to have to link everyone and compare four characters that don't know each other, actually making them interacting with food is a very easy way and pivotal way to kind of give everyone one reference point for both readers and characters. So I hope I make some time articulating myself well, but I do think that food can be both very central in a plot, in like kind of being a scene almost, and a development, and being that kind of framework and background that is just used as a reference point. And I think that's also something that's so helpful as a reader, because again, we all eat differently, but we all do eat.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of striking to me too, like when I typically think about like food in a novel setting, I think of like, I don't know if you've read like Water for Chocolate.
Yeah.
So, I immediately go to like magical realism and like that as a literary device, which is very overt in some ways, right? And I think to what you're saying, like, and particularly in your writing, like it gets at that mundane element where you don't even really realize like how it's shaping your interpretation of a character until you go through and do like a closer read of how that is happening as well.
Okay.
So I kind of want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the idea of starvation, because I just read Death Valley by Melissa Broder, where the character goes out into the desert and it's the act of like not eating that drives a pretty like profound change in this character's life. Do you think starvation is, or I guess, how do you interpret the idea of using starvation for character development or story writing in general?
Yeah, I actually love this. I haven't read Death Valley, to be honest, but now I really want to read it. I think it's brave. Such
Yeah.
a tough topic. I think, it could go wrong really easily. Maybe I'm projecting my own fear, but I feel like salvation is like, it's a tricky topic, because either, especially again, maybe as a woman, I'm very much aware of any type of conversation around disordered eating, or even just troubled relationship with food. Starvation made me a bit worried. How am I going to approach it? Straight away? I feel a bit tiptoeing because I don't want to be saying something wrong, and that's self-censorship, really. But it also is, in terms of kind of society, it's a difficult topic, because as we know, especially these days, even, threatenedly a kind of wealthy country, is a real problem these days. A lot of children go hungry, a lot of adults go hungry, and the food banks are full. So it's such a like really heavy topic. I think it's really brave to go there. But at the same time, as a writer and someone who is deeply, deeply interested in the psychology of characters and people, I think starvation is fascinating, because we all know it will affect your brain quite deep. How long until you are not thinking rationally? Not that long when you go starve. So yeah, I genuinely love this idea. Actually, I have not made, and I never thought about it.
Yeah, it's I only got to thinking about it in preparation for this conversation, because I didn't even realize, again, like until I started thinking about what you had mentioned about how irritating it is when people don't use food in novels. I was like, that book really, I'm fairly certain the reason I was like on edge and like flipping through it was because there was no food. And I was like, is this going to continue? But I think you also raise a really important point around like perhaps the responsibility of writers in contemporary settings to kind of speak more toward the reality of food costs or cost of living crisis as well. So how do you kind of position yourself as a writer, or how do you see your responsibilities to what's going on in the world that you're experiencing?
Very important in both nonfiction and fiction. But also, actually, I think very important to say it in fiction. And again, that's when food is really important. I think we can't just have food in fiction when it's a big ceremonious dinner or meal. And that's why, again, the mundane is so important, and how people eat, because yes, we all, I don't know, I think that's going to be probably very relatable to a few other creatives out there. People who are struggling a bit financially, especially these days. The first thing I do is I try to cut my food spend. That would be the first thing. Don't get me wrong, I'm not being hungry at all. I'm not even pretending, but I will be very careful, and I think that should definitely be reflected these days. But also, kind of responsibility. How do we choose to eat? Our relationship with meat, our relationship with packaging, our relationship with all these kind of things. That is really important. And I think on the food writing, in the nonfiction, there are amazing things being published out there. People are really doing a fantastic job and very researched, profound, well thought piece. And yeah, one of them definitely are like,
No.
in fiction, I'm saying it less coming naturally, maybe because it's too early. We also know, as a fiction writer, I can tell you, a book gets published within 3 to 4 years after starting writing it. So,
Right.
maybe they just haven't come out yet as well. And they will. But yeah, I would hope that would become a really important topic.
Yeah, me too. And I didn't even consider that it takes so long to publish a fiction book as well, in terms of the trends that we see in nonfiction versus fiction. I'm curious if you have examples of books where you think they did a really fantastic job of using food not just as device, but as like part of everyday life, or using it in a way that kind of speaks to acknowledgement of like contemporary food issues.
Yeah. It's interesting that also the question is coming now, because I was thinking about this before our conversation. And most of the books I could think of were classics. I was really struggling to come up with contemporary fiction ideas. And then, we've had this chat now. I'm realizing that it's because also I'm thinking of like 20th century French literature, and that's
Right.
there was very little food, and that was a real problem. Access to food and access to wealth in general, a very high poverty level. So here we go, full circle. Where is 2024 that differs? That's into that. Or I could think of a lot of literature in translation. I was thinking about The Door by Magda Szabo.
Okay,
I'm
yeah.
saying her name wrongly because she's Hungarian, and it's been translated in English, so it's available. And I think it's Magda's done a fantastic job at using food in that background I was talking about. So this kind of very intimate relationship between two women. One of them is kind of a writer, intellectual, and then her housekeeper. They often reunite around food or use food as arguments. But that's not really staged, that's not said, but the food is in the background and is so well done. And once again, as a reader coming into having never read before literature from Hungary, knowing quite honestly little about the history of the country apart from the obvious, I found it so helpful. It gave me such a good way of being able to picture, where they might be living, the house, the organization, how does even the kitchen might look like. I don't know, as a pure European, I would always say the first place when you're in a home, everyone realizes in the kitchen. But that's like so narrow-minded of me, that's probably not the same everywhere. So that was so interesting. And yeah, that's why I thought about it, because it's a good example of a book where I had no context whatsoever. And without the food, I don't think I would have got as much about the power dynamics between those two women, apart from the pure obvious, or me doing some mirroring from my own experience, which would have been irrelevant because I can't. It's very different. I've grown up in a very, very different background.
Well, I'm definitely going to check that book out now. You've absolutely
amazing.
sold me on it. That sounds incredible. But especially the idea of like using the kitchen and using food as like a place for conflict and argument, because the reality is like, I mean, how many past relationships have I had where we get into a fight in the kitchen and like there's knives and there's heat and there's already like so much at stake. So it's surprising to me now that you're saying that that's not as commonplace in literature.
Mhm.
So obviously you have a book, The Yellow Kitchen, that centralizes around a kitchen, but I wanted to speak a little bit more to that because similar to what you're saying, like the kitchen for me is the place where like we all go at the end of the day to meet, and we've got like a little island so people can like sit there while we're cooking or whatever, and like that's the place for like conversation and connection. What's the role of the kitchen to you in your writing, but then also in life? Is there a relationship between the two at all?
There is. Well, like most people, during lockdown, I spend a lot of time at my kitchen table. You know, working, eating, writing it, or just pushing the plate, putting the laptop, pushing the laptop, putting the plate. And that was a lovely loop to be doing. But yes, I do spend quite a lot of time in the kitchen, and I don't know, but I think since I was really young, even though we had very little cooking in the house, I grew up with a very mighty single mom who was wrestling incredible working house, two children in a tiny flat, and two dogs and a cat.
Wow. Oh my
Just
gosh.
because she's just on fire like that. And we always had this kind of like small houses, but it somehow all my friends would always come around, and we would always just all stick around this very, very narrow kitchen we had. And I have just incredible memories of this. And I would do no cooking, but just grab some whatever she had and just put it in the middle, and everyone would just be happy in there. And I've always identified the kitchen like that. And my mom always said, whatever we do, if we are late and she didn't have time, just clean the kitchen because we don't care. People just only go to the kitchen. Uh, we just all run like that and just start cleaning the kitchen quickly, and the rest of the house would just be a mess. And it was fine. I don't know. Sorry, it's very emotional of me, but like it's just like,
No, it's beautiful.
yeah. And then having lived in a lot of flat share in my life, the kitchen is also the only room where we all hang out. My last flat share, we had this really decadent, really big living room. I don't remember it. I genuinely don't remember it. We never spent any time in it.
No
But in the
kidding.
kitchen, we were always in there. Even though it was in the back of the house, it was so cold in there, where our living room was like south facing, really bright all the time. Nobody in there. Everyone was always in the kitchen. And yeah, any house I've had, it's always been kind of the case. So it's a place of like reunion, but also for me, it's a place of thinking. I will spend time in there, and yeah, I tend to write. I have this little stool that I keep just outside of the kitchen, and I just bring it in, and I just sat in there, and I write on the kitchen counter, which is the most uncomfortable position because I have to sit on the side. My legs obviously can't fit underneath. And I'm just like contorting myself and just start writing. And it just feels really safe in there. I really enjoy it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that because I think it was really warming to hear that. I know, like for my daughter and I, that was also our place, and like that's why it's kind of continued as well. And I don't know why. It's just like that's the place that feels safe, as you said. And I also really love, like I think you had mentioned it in like a newsletter or something a while back about how you draft your work at the kitchen table, and there's just something about knowing that, particularly given like the tone and the energy that you bring to your writing, particularly around food, where just knowing that little detail adds like some texture to what we're reading about your work as well.
Thank you.
So Margaux, thank you so much for joining me. I could chat with you forever. This has been like such a fun conversation to explore. But if people want to read your books, your newsletter, or anything else you have going on, where can they find you?
Yes, they find me online. I
Yeah.
have a newsletter which is called The Onion Papers, and that's on Substack. And I am also always happy to just quite informally connect with people on Instagram. I think I'm Margaux Vialleron, something like that, but we can link it in the show notes.
For sure.
Yeah, or just Google me, a show up. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Margaux. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Having me. I love this conversation.
Me too. That was Margaux Vialleron. I've linked her books, including Breaststrokes, and her social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at my website at AnthroDish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to AnthroDish Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or really wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out. For more AnthroDish, you can sign up for my newsletter at sarahdougnan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook at AnthroDish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're thinking about food. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. AnthroDish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.